Welcome back to Purrfect Takes. I'm your host, Stephen Patton, joined as always by my co-host and dear friend, Jacob McQuire. And for our audience, this was a controversy when Jacob got on today. We were wondering who's wearing the better blue shirt or who's pulling off the blue shirt better. So for everybody who's watching on YouTube, let us know in the comments who's pulling it off. I think Jacob's is closer to the process blue, repping that Carolina blue. But I think I have a solid athletic blue, a little bit darker in context. But again, let us know in the comments. Title of the episode today is Running Backs Matter. And I think that's important because over the past decade, I think this is the position that's been hurt the most by analytics. There's a whole website dedicated. The acronym is quite simply running backs don't matter. Is this whole knock on those players are not worth the contracts that they get paid. They have a shorter life expectancy in terms of like a player's career, very, very short compared to other positions. And the return on investment wasn't as much. And so you saw the NFL market kind of shift over the past decade. It didn't catch up with some of these other position groups that were kind of growing as the salary cap grew. And what's interesting is last year, a lot of like superstar names hit free agency. And like you would have thought, like based on the production they had this year, they would have been snatched up like that by every other team. But it was a lot of savvy teams that had been to the postseason the year before that got better when they added these running backs. And of course, the three guys I'm mostly referring to are Saquon Barkley to the Philadelphia Eagles, now Super Bowl champions. Derrick Henry to the Baltimore Ravens, helped Lamar Jackson get his third first-team All-Pro, and he was runner-up with the MVP. And then Josh Jacobs in Green Bay. So you see the impact that some of these running backs still have on these second, third contracts. And so I think that's key when we look at this free agency class, that why there isn't that superstar depth. There is a lot of capable starters that have been picked up to be kind of a key piece to the offense. And I think in the draft, there's a couple superstars, but I think we should start with free agency. What are the kind of key takeaways from this offseason?
Well, running backs certainly matter. I think that's my number one takeaway. Not necessarily with the new guys joining new teams, but you talked about Saquon Barkley, right? Won the Super Bowl. He was Offensive Player of the Year, right? Yeah, he was. I think unanimous, which was odd because Jamar Chase had the Triple Crown, but Saquon got to 2,000 yards in 16 games. And then after being the driving force in the playoffs for the Eagles offense, they rewarded him this offseason. He got a massive extension to where he's making just over $20 million a year the next, I think it's the 2 years following the last year of his deal. So it's a 3-year deal as it stands, but he certainly matters to the Eagles, right? They wouldn't be able to do what they did without him. And yeah, like we've gotten to the point where the whole argument, oh, they're so replaceable, it's this, that, whatever. Yeah, that's kind of out the window. We've seen teams recently, you talk about drafting running backs. Bijan Robinson went 8th overall just a couple of drafts ago. Jahmyr Gibbs goes 12th overall in that same draft. And I think this year we're going to see something quite similar in the first round. But before we get to that, I think it's good to mention free agents. Obviously, Saquon wasn't a free agent, but he got that big extension. The first free agent running back that signed was Aaron Jones, and he actually went back to the team he was with this year, Minnesota. His deal was $20 million over 2 years. I think that was the biggest non-Saquon running back deal, and I think it's much deserved. It was the day right before legal tampering started, or however you want to call the negotiating period, and I think he was a big part of the like the underneath security blanket stuff for Sam Darnold this year, and having that continuity in the offense, I think is going to be big for, we presume, JJ McCarthy to be the starter. Won't be his rookie year, but it will be his first year starting, and just keeping a good running back and keeping the system going will always be good for a young QB making his first couple starts.
Absolutely. Aaron Jones is one of the smarter running backs in the NFL when you can have continuity at that position, even though I don't think his production was near the top of the market. That's always great when you're able to kind of keep that together. Going back to your point about Saquon Barkley, I think what's interesting is obviously the offensive line is always the driving force. But we saw kind of like the difference between having a DeAndre Swift, a Miles Sanders behind that Eagles offensive line, and then putting a superstar running back behind that offensive line. And obviously running backs aren't adding a ton to the win column. Saquon wasn't really helping the Giants like get to the playoffs. You really need a quarterback and a team as a whole to operate in order to win games. But when you have some of these pieces on offense, it allows you to do different things and have different answers for different problems you may face as an offense. And I think we saw that a lot with Matt LaFleur as he evolved and grew with the run game in Green Bay. And then the same, obviously, in Baltimore and Philadelphia. So just kind of key points as we talk about the free agents that are leaving their old locations and places they were drafted from to a new destination. I think the first guy to talk about here is Najee Harris, obviously a Alabama product, played for Pittsburgh. I think he's played in at least 17 games, obviously including some postseason games since he's been drafted, pretty much his whole career. He's been good for 250 touches every single year of his career. This is somebody that you can count on in terms of just having somebody to hand the ball off to that's going to get you 4 yards a carry. I don't think he's super explosive. His contract obviously shows that he's not valued at the top of the market, but I think this is a good value signing, and he's going to be a reliable running back for that Chargers offense.
Yeah, if there's one thing, I was going to say John Harbaugh. If there's one thing Jim Harbaugh wants to do, it's run the ball, right? And while I think at the beginning of last year, the Chargers were effective with that when J.K. Dobbins was healthy, they kind of tapered off toward the end of the season there. So getting a guy who's reliable like Najee Harris, you mentioned it, 4 straight years. We've had 17 games for 4 years now. It doesn't seem like it, but all 4 years he played in all 17. All 4 years, he had over 1,000 rushing yards. So if he's anything, he's consistent in having that behind, hopefully a healthier and retooled, especially interior of their O-line, because toward the end of the year, they were quite banged up and quite bad there. But if they can get that all situated, I think it'll work out great there, because I'm pretty sure Greg Roman's still calling the plays. He's going to call some runs. And I think one of the things that with the Chargers is interesting to me. Like, they came into this offseason with close to $100 million in cap space. They were, I believe, 11-6 coming off of a playoff loss. We don't need to talk about how they played in the playoffs. It was quite bad. But outside of the Najee Harris deal, they haven't really done a ton. And I know it's not top of the market for Najee Harris, but outside of the Aaron Jones deal, it is the highest person who's going to a new team. And my question to you is kind of on a tangent. What's the Chargers' plan, right? Because they kind of need to solidify the interior of the O-line. Ladd McConkey is still receiver 1, and they brought back Mike Williams, I guess, to be a complimentary piece after jettisoning him, 2 off seasons ago, 1 off seasons ago now. And like, what's going on with the Chargers, right? Because this is a team to me that, despite having $100 million in cap space, maybe has gotten worse this offseason, hasn't really gotten better.
Yeah, so they lose. I think it was Kendall Fulton was their one cornerback who had been dealing with some injury. Christian Fulton, yes, came from Tennessee, played last year in Los Angeles, was phenomenal in Jesse Minter's system. Gone to Kansas City now, and defensive back was already a concern. They cut Joey Bosa. They bring back Khalil Mack. So they kind of do some reshuffling there. They haven't addressed the interior offensive line. They really haven't addressed wide receiver outside of bringing Mike Williams back, but they lose Josh Palmer. So I think that's kind of like a wash in that standpoint. They signed Dante Jackson, Benjamin St-Juste, 2, I would say, below average, if not like pretty poor starters.
Well, St-Juste for sure. I wouldn't even put him below average. Whatever's underneath that.
Like he should be on a practice squad. I don't understand that. But again, I didn't understand a lot of the way the Chargers defense would kind of cohesively play last year. So maybe they have a plan for a player of his type. But it's a lot of head scratching moves. Like you said, came in the free agency with a lot of money. They did not aggressively go after interior offensive linemen like we saw a team like the Chicago Bears do. And I think that's going to help them this year, having that shored up. And so that was a little perplexing that they didn't do that. But again, maybe they have a plan that Zion Johnson, who's been their guard, they can put him at center and they can pick somebody else up at guard and kind of re-solidify that interior. For me, it's wide receiver that they didn't really go after anybody else to kind of pair with Ladd McConkey. And they're going to have to address that, I think, in the draft. And maybe with where they're picking, they can get one of those top 3 wide receivers in this class. And I think that would be huge. I think that kind of athleticism explosion from maybe some of those prospects is really what's going to help take this offense to the next level. Only concern is Greg Roman and this offense aren't really accustomed to using wide receivers. So this is where kind of rubber meets the road. Is this the right offensive play caller for this offense when you're trying to take that next step? Does Jim Harbaugh's kind of vision for this team and this offense come to fruition? Or do they go in a completely different direction? Do they go like an Mario Hampton in the draft and really juice up the run game and just say, hey, Herbert and Ladd McConkey will figure out the passing game?
Well, I hope they figure it out a little bit better than they did in the playoff game last year. I think it was 4 interceptions, 2 pick sixes. Obviously not going to cut it. Another team that doesn't usually do anything in free agency, but they've signed like 2 exterior free agents, which might be a record high for them over the past couple of years, is the Dallas Cowboys. And while they lose Rico Dowdle to actually our Carolina Panthers, they went and signed Javonte Williams to replace him from the Denver Broncos. To me, this isn't a super inspiring move. Then I guess Rico Dowdle wasn't super inspiring for them last year, in my opinion, but they needed a starting running back unless they wanted to give Zeke another deal, which you can never put it past Jerry Jones. But this seems to be, again, we're going to have to rely on our draft picks kind of team instead of, hey, we just opened up 55, 60 million in cap space. Let's go get at least one difference maker before we extend Micah Parsons. But they got their starting running back, presumably. This is a deep running back class where it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of these teams that sign people went and got a guy on round 3 or round 4, kind of like you're talking about with the Chargers with Amari and Hampton, who I think will be day 1. But I can see the vision for a lot of these teams getting like 1-year stopgap veterans while they draft a guy as well.
I'm talking about 1-year stopgaps. I think the best example of that is the 1-year deal that Rico Dowdle got from the Carolina Panthers. Obviously, their vision for the running back room last year was Chuba Hubbard and obviously Jonathan Brooks. But with the ACL tear last fall, it makes sense that, hey, let's pick up a guy that we trust as a running back, that is a good receiver out of the backfield, that you were hoping Brooks was going to be when he got back from his college injury. And so to get that kind of in that year in between, I think allows Brooks to come back fully healthy and play the last 2 years on his rookie contract before evaluating him for a potential extension. So again, another signing. He performed a lot better than Javonte Williams did last year. So it's very interesting to see the Cowboys let Rico Dowdle walk and sign Javonte Williams. I'm hoping they have a vision for that outside of Javonte Williams. I know you brought up Zeke, but that is a position that they're going to need to address. Maybe they're high on Cam Skattebo. Obviously, they got Deuce Vaughn, a smaller, more intriguing running back prospect a couple years ago. So they could be all over the board with this pick, but it will be interesting to monitor because I don't think they're done necessarily at the running back.
Well, I hope not for Dak's sake and for that offense's sake, but I talked about Rico Dowdle not inspiring me a ton in Dallas, but I don't think Dallas's run blocking or O-line in general was up to par like we've seen them in years past. But coming to Carolina and pairing with Chuba Hubbard, I'm really excited about that. You mentioned that he can be like the pass catching back out of the backfield, on third downs. I think his run game complements Chuba's as well. And behind our run blocking O-line, which is, I would say, right around top 10, maybe like 11th, 12th there, I think that could be special. I'm not going to say this is the next double trouble or thunder and lightning or anything, but I really like the complementary skill set that these guys have. And it wouldn't surprise me if we had 2 running backs that have, 800 or more scrimmage yards next year if Dave Canales is able to use them effectively.
Absolutely. No, when you look at the combined scrimmage yards for these two, it would rank out of last year 3rd. And the only 2 people that it would be behind would be the Detroit Lions with the Gibbs and David Montgomery pairing. And then the Baltimore Ravens with Derrick Henry and Justice Hill. And if you were to include Lamar Jackson's rushing yards instead of Justice Hill's, I think be even higher. But those are the only 2 teams, 2 duos that had more scrimmage yards. So I expect a lot from these 2. And what's interesting in the top 5, The other two running back duos are actually in the NFC South. You have the Atlanta Falcons with Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier, who combined for over 2,600 yards. And you had Bucky Irving and Rachaad White combined for over 2,500 scrimmage yards. So a lot of interesting duos in the NFC South. The only team that doesn't is the New Orleans Saints. They're kind of in a weird predicament at running back with an aging one at Alvin Kamara. And then kind of the rest of the running back room, just I wouldn't say a bunch of no names, but just a bunch of unproven players at this point.
Yeah, they might bring Mark Ingram back for like a fifth stint with the team at this point. He might need it, but yeah, I really like Rico Dowdle. Yeah, big trust. A caveat there is the Falcons and Buccaneers both played the Panthers run defense twice. So you got to have a little bit of an asterisk there because I think we allowed the third most rushing yards ever. So maybe if we've patched up the run defense like we talked about on Tuesday, that'll change next year. But some of the smaller signings, A.J. Dillon going to Philadelphia. Now he and Saquon can have like who has the biggest quads. Like they can have that competition finally. Kenneth Gainwell, speaking of Philly, he signs with Pittsburgh. And to be honest, I don't know who's going to be the RB1 there. They have him, Jalen Warren, and Cordero Patterson. A lot of pass catching backs, not a lot of pound the rock down the middle type of running backs. And I think it's going to be by committee if they don't draft somebody. And then just today, Raheem Mostert and Alexander Mattison flip-flopped. Mostert goes to Vegas. Mattison goes to Miami. And I don't really think of Mattison as like a speedy guy. So I'm interested to see how Mike McDaniel's going to use him. But those are some of the smaller names that have been signed. And then I guess the only two big names that haven't been signed yet, J.K. Dobbins of the Chargers, and then Nick Chubb. I don't know how that's going to work out with him, like coming off of the injury. Well, he actually came back this past season. Wasn't his usual self as expected, but I wonder what kind of market, if any, he's going to have, or if he's just going to return to Cleveland because, that's been his home throughout his entire career.
Yeah, that one will be an interesting one to monitor. I think it's really going to come back on the medicals, and I'm sure teams are doing their due diligence because he's a very talented player. He was able to come back last year, showing the resilience of just who he is as a person. So there's a lot of things that are commendable that you would want in a running back. It's just a matter if it's right fit. I mean, if his knee's 100%, and I don't know if either of those two things are necessarily going to pan out. So we'll just have to keep an eye on that. J.K. Dobbins, same thing. I just don't think he's ever had the burst he had since his injuries back with Baltimore. Obviously, he had a really productive year with Los Angeles, but I think Najee Harris is going to perform better in that role of just being your bell cow. And then you talked about how the Steelers kind of have this vacancy of having that guy that you can tote the ball downs 1 through 3. And for me, and I know we're going to get into the draft here in a little bit, but I think Caleb Johnson out of Iowa would be a perfect target in that respect. I think he's a big physical runner, patient at that in terms of vision. I wouldn't necessarily call him a Le'Veon Bell, but there are just attributes you would like about a running back like that, potentially on day 2, if you're looking to fill maybe a starter role and simply have some of these other tailbacks as complementary pieces in Jalen Warren and Kenneth Gainwell.
Yeah, I like, and it's not just you. I'm guilty of it too. Every time I watch a college back and see a little bit of patience, I'm like, oh man, Le'Veon Bell. Like that's the first name I come to. But to your point, the Steelers, they kind of need their go-to guy. And as I was going through teams that didn't really have an RB1 or they still needed somebody, the Raiders, right? They just signed Raheem Mostert, but I don't know if that's enough. I don't know if the Bears are content. Ben Johnson comes from a system where there's 2 starting running backs, and DeAndre Swift and Rashawn Johnson was mainly a red zone guy last year, so I'm not sure how that's going to be. The Broncos, they lose Javonte Williams, haven't really replaced that yet. They had Audric Estime from last year's draft.
They have Jaleel McLaughlin.
That's true.
Those two guys might be the committee, but like you said, they may also be kind of in the pool of the draft because they also picked up Evan Ingram, so maybe they don't draft a tight end.
That's true. The Patriots, I know Ramondre Stevenson seemed to have been benched a couple of times last year, even though he wasn't. For the people watching on YouTube, I did air quotes because if you're a fantasy football player, you get updates before Sunday so you can take people in and out of your lineup. But one of the updates I got last year, it's like week 11 or something. It was like, they're benching Ramondre Stevenson. Then he was out there for the first play and got the carry. So I don't understand how the benching works there. I think the Chiefs could use a stable starter. I was not a fan of Isaiah Pacheco after he came back last year. I don't think the the burst and explosion was there. The Titans, I know they have Pollard and Spears, but neither of those guys are a true one. The Bengals, too, if Chase Brown doesn't come back fully, and the Texans, if they're not sold on Mixon. My point being, there are a lot of teams that don't have a bona fide RB1 kind of guy that they believe they can rely upon. And to your point, getting into draft talk, this is a loaded running back draft. We're going to have guys like Ashton Genty, who's going to go in the first round, who I believe will probably go similarly high to where Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs went a couple years ago. Amarian Hampton, like you talked about in North Carolina, he's going to go round 1 too. I know people might not be like, a running back in round 1, if he's not Ashton Genty, he's going to go round 1. And then you have a lot of other guys beneath that, and then a huge category of 20 or so guys after that are draftable. We might set a record for the amount of running backs drafted in the last decade or so. I know probably back in the day, they probably drafted like 100 running backs in the draft, but I think in the last 10 years, maybe this might be the most running backs we see drafted.
It very well may be. I would have to look back and see that number. I'm sure as we approach the draft, those numbers will become more public as people are kind of comparing this draft class to others that have come before it. I think when we look at this running back class, you're exactly right that Ashton Genty kind of takes the cream of the crop. There have been comparisons that he's a LaDainian Tomlinson, a D'Angelo Williams, but for me, when he's standing back there behind the line of scrimmage before the ball is snapped, and I can't take credit for this, and I wish I remembered who had the original kind of coining of this for Genty, is that he stands back there and he looks like Michael Myers. He looks like he's about to kill somebody. And it's so nonchalant. He comes straight out of that standing up stance to taking the ball, and then he's just so decisive, just with his cuts, with where he's going with the football. His contact, his balance after contact is just phenomenal. It's just one of those things where he's just gliding off contact like butter. And it is just a pure joy to watch him run the football. You could chalk it up to that he was playing weaker opponents, but the times that he played a team like Oregon or Penn State, he still balled out. And so I don't think that there's anything about his game that isn't going to translate. My biggest knock on him is maybe the pass protection. I think Omarion Hampton, I think what's great about him is he has a great combination of speed, burst, and explosion, and also having that balance with contact. I felt like he fell down a couple times at the line of scrimmage and wasn't really kind of falling forward a couple of yards. But again, there's just so much to love about those two running backs games. And I think that is kind of after that, we start talking about running backs in a different light. And my question to you is, and I was doing a little bit of research, and really what clued me on there's got to be an injury history, as I started looking at just how many kind of carries Travion Henderson and Judkins had in that Ohio State offense. Henderson this past year, as Ohio State went on their championship run, eclipsed 11 carries only once all year. And looking back, he's had a couple foot injuries. He hasn't been extremely healthy, and why he's very explosive, why I would put him in that Jahmyr Gibbs in terms of a big play, just like he has that ability to break a big one. That injury concern, a lot of these other running backs don't have. And for me, this is where I would lean to a guy that I just brought up a couple minutes ago, and Caleb Johnson. I think he's a great running back. Again, great vision. I think he is more of a power runner than some of the other running backs that we've mentioned up to this point. But again, after the first two, that's where it kind of drops off and we start talking about some of these other guys that are impactful. But I think some of what they do best are very, I wouldn't say narrow traits, but they're very specific traits for each of these running backs.
For sure. And I know we're grouping Hampton and Genty kind of in a group because they'll both be round 1. But to me, Genty stands far above Amari and Hampton. Like you're saying, in terms of translatable weaknesses for Ashton Genty, to me, it really is his pass pro. And I understand why, because he wasn't pass blocking a ton. He probably didn't get a ton of reps to practice that because he got the ball every time. I know LaDainian Tomlinson is a popular one, and I don't like giving prospects such high ceiling comps because I feel like it's unfair that they're going to live up to those comparisons. But I can see it with him. One of them that's probably more realistic, like a realistic outcome for him, I think early career Alvin Kamara, who could never be tackled. He was smooth like butter
Yeah.
and would just bounce off of players. That's how Ashton Genty is. Just never gets taken down, even by some of the Penn State and Oregon secondary players. They were struggling to bring him down. And while he did have a couple fumbles in those games, particularly the Penn State playoff game, he still performed admirably. He was like all of the offense in the Penn State game. It's taking like 8 or 9 guys to tackle him in that playoff game. Everything you said, Genty has. He has the good breakaway speed. He's a receiver too. Like he can catch the ball out of the backfield. Just a truly complete prospect. And for me, he is my highest rated offensive prospect right now. And outside of, I think Travis Hunter is going to end up being number 1 for me. I think Genty would have my highest grade overall. We'll have to see between him and Abdul Carter once I finish defenders. But I truly think Genty is translatable and that good of a talent. And then we do get to Amarian Hampton from North Carolina. Shout out the Tar Heels in North Carolina. He's special too. Like you're saying, he reminds me, a comp I would do is Kyron Williams, but with a little bit more burst. Kyron Williams, like 3 or 4 years ago when he was drafted, one of the things I wrote on the notes that I took for him was he was a better pass blocker than some of the O linemen at Notre Dame. Like that's how vicious of a blocker he is. I kind of see that with Amarian Hampton, like you're talking about. Like he'll see his assignment, he'll fit the gap and go and attack linebackers, attack stunts and stuff like that. A lot of times you'll see running backs kind of wait for the people to come to them and kind of just get in the way, right? Like fall backwards and then like let the quarterback escape. Hampton's going in there like he's a fullback, ready to blow it up. And I really like that about him. Outside of Genty, he might be the best pass catching back in this class as well.
Yeah.
Hampton is very well rounded. He's kind of patient too. I don't know if he's the Le'Veon Bell patient, but I think he has that as well. And my biggest thing for him, and you alluded to it earlier, he's not a 100% falls forward running back. Like he's not a pile pusher, so to speak. And I'm not sure that it's fair to knock running backs that aren't built like Mack trucks for that trait, because they're not going to be guys that you hand the ball off on first and goal from the 1, right? You have fullbacks for that. You have, if you're the Bills, you have a Josh Allen for that. Like you have the bigger body players for that. And I'm not necessarily expecting him to do that every single play, but he also stands above the rest. And then you mentioned it. You got into that next group, Travion Henderson, who I believe it was his sophomore year, dealt with a pretty significant foot injury. And then Caleb Johnson and Quinshad Judkins from Ohio State as well. You brought up the amount of touches I think Travion Henderson took this past season. If you look at both Henderson and Judkins, both of the Ohio State running backs, production, I believe they are 2 yards apart in total yards, and I believe they have the exact same amount of touchdowns. So I'm not super concerned about the lack of touches when Henderson, who is number 3 running back on my board, has that explosive ability and doesn't need the 20 touches a game or 25 touches a game. I don't think you should be giving a running back 25 touches a game in the league. I think you should spread it out a little bit, like a 60-30-10 split. But with Travion Henderson, true breakaway speed. You saw it in I can't remember which playoff game it was. I think it was Oregon, where he just fried the safeties back there. Like he got down the right sideline, gone. You saw it again in the Tennessee game as well. He's a good and willing blocker as well. Both of the Ohio State guys are. He's more of the agile and quick guy compared to Judkins, run through the middle and take on like take hits and stuff like that. My biggest knock on Travion Henderson, I think you talked about it as well, his contact balance needs to improve. He's the home run hitter, but if you have a stronger safety like Derwin James is down in the box and while he's falling, he slaps you in the shin, that's going to knock Travion Henderson over at this moment. But I think his ability to take any run to the house has him standing just a little bit ahead of both Caleb Johnson and Judkins. But in that group, 3 through 5, you could really order them in whatever order you want. To me, I just value the home run hitting ability there. I value Caleb Johnson's ability more as a well-rounded guy and as a pass receiver as well. And then Judkins is more of the guy I want on shorter yardage situations, but all of them are good.
Yeah, and to talk about, because Judkins is probably the guy that I think the least of out of the two mentioned before. Travion
Mhm.
Henderson, like you said, he's got that big playability. Again, it just comes down to a touch standpoint. Judkins, I think, had over 11 carries 8 times. And like you said, their yard count, their touchdown count, very similar. Judkins was more of the bell cow in that Ohio State offense. And so you can at least get that kind of production. When I was watching Judkins, I didn't feel like I saw some of the cuts that I would typically see once he hit the hole. Caleb Johnson, very definitive when he would hit the
Mhm.
hole and attack those rushing lanes. I think the biggest knock on him is that when that got taken away against Ohio State in the one game I watched, the front seven just suffocated running lanes, and he wasn't able to get past that. But I think if he's given the lanes and some blocking at the next level, and you aren't having these 8-man boxes where all the gaps are being filled and they know exactly what's coming, I think we're going to see Caleb Johnson look more like the Caleb Johnson we saw in games outside of the Ohio State game. I'm not a big fan of him. You brought up his pass catching ability. I'm not a big fan of that. I don't think he attacks the ball necessarily with his hands as well. And his mobility when he's out behind a screen isn't the best. But on outside runs, he is very explosive. He can get to the edge, and there is a lot to like about his game. I think he is more, out of these three running backs, he is probably the most well-rounded in my opinion. But then after we kind of get past these guys, then we start getting into, I would say, either late day 2 or day 3 picks, and you can definitely find starters. I mean, we saw Bucky Irving last year. Ray Davis might jump into more of a starting role with the Buffalo Bills. Braylon Allen was taken by the Jets. He saw a pretty decent amount of reps. And so it's very interesting to see that some of these guys that maybe been taken after these top 5 still have a pretty large impact in year 1.
For sure. And I think the next group that you're talking about there, and I think this guy might still go on day 2, but he was kind of a sensation during the championship weekend and subsequent playoff run for Arizona State. That's Cam Skattebo. He really made a name for himself versus Texas in that playoff game where Arizona State would eventually lose, but it went to overtime. He's a do-it-all threat, except he can't, like, he's not fast. That's his big knock. He doesn't have breakaway speed. If he gets past you, you can recover. Even if you're a linebacker, you could probably recover. And I wrote on Pass Pro, his Pass Pro, while effective, he doesn't really block as much as he tries to chop defenders' legs. And if you do that wrong in the NFL, one of 3 things is going to happen. 1, it's going to be a penalty for a chop block. 2, the D lineman is going to like slap you down to the ground and jump over you because they're used to that. Like, imagine trying to do that to Myles Garrett. He's just going to look at you while he's doing it. And 3, if they're mad enough at you, if you've been doing it enough, they're going to step on you while they're getting over you. So you can't really block like that in the NFL. And I know I keep harping on the Texas game, but if you go back and watch that, I think it really shows how much of even a triple threat, because he threw a pass in that game, he can be. I think he's a legitimate receiving threat. Even though he doesn't explode into space, he knows like how to use his body to get there. He has very good contact balance. I said he wasn't fast, but he's a bowling ball. It takes a lot of people to bring him down. He's a good quick guy. He has like a one cut and go, but once you go, he's not really gonna outrun anybody. Like, he's decisive where he wants to go, but again, after that initial burst, he's not showing any burners. And I think part of the reason he didn't run the 40 and do the speed testing and agility testing at the combine was due to that. I think he did run the 40, but didn't do the agility testing.
He
I
did the
think.
agility testing. That's
Are
what's
you
showing
sure?
up here. It's broad jump, vertical. I don't think he did the shuttle and 3-cone, but he did the
Yeah.
40 and some of the other. There are
Yeah,
different
maybe
drills based on position.
I'm
Um,
misconstruing a couple people, but he like intentionally neglected some of the drills for
yeah.
running backs, and I think his lack of speed on game tape can speak to that. But other than, if you're not looking for a home run hitter and you're looking for a guy that can do everything else, I think Skattebo is the guy there.
Yeah, for me, it's what you're expecting out of the running back position. And at first, just because I had seen a couple plays, saw the one bowl game where he did it all. Uh, the thing that kind of jumped off like the top of my mind was kind of like Mike Tolbert. The tool are just bouncing off guys, being that bigger bodied, like almost fullback. Like maybe he can be a modern day Kyle Juszczyk. And the more I started looking into things and seeing reports and honestly seeing comparisons and then watching the film, he does kind of remind me of like a Michael Turner or a
Yeah,
more
that's a
modern
really good
day
one. Yeah.
like James Conner. And if you see the way he runs and you see the athletic testing in terms of like his burst and explosion, like he hits that hole and he's gone. And same with like catching the ball. And he doesn't necessarily have the greatest twitch. He definitely doesn't have that top end speed to break away, but having that kind of just power and explosion off the line is something special to have in a running game. And I think he can be very complimentary to someone that might have a little bit more finesse and allow him to kind of be the big bad bruiser, maybe even kind of getting close to that 3-down back without having to be the 3-down back. And I think the best analogy for this is everybody was getting hyped up about Carson Steele for the Kansas City Chiefs last year when Isaiah Pacheco went down. For me, everything that everybody thought Carson Steele was, that's what Cam Scatterbo is. It's a big physical runner that actually does have a little bit of speed. And I think some of that does translate to the next level. But like you said, between some of the pass pro stuff with him leading with his head and just not having the top end speed, it has a lot of people worried if his game will translate.
For sure. And I think you brought up a good point. Like, if you can pair him with somebody who's more of a fast finesse runner, that would be a very good pairing in the NFL. And I have Scatterbo at running back 7, I believe, on my board. Yeah. And the guy I have at 6, who I'm a bit higher on than the consensus boards, is a finesse guy, is a fast guy. That's Dylan Sampson from Tennessee. I talked about Travion Henderson having breakaway speed. Dylan Sampson's their real breakaway speed guy. He has the finesse you're looking for, really good vision. Once he sees the hole, gone like that. And there's nothing you can do about it. He really excelled against Alabama in the game Tennessee won there. Good contact balance, too, for his size. He's a bit slender. A bit more slender than a lot of people in this class. Good hands, good initial burst into the hole with that good breakaway speed, which is always a good pairing. His thing, though, kind of weak. He has average strength, and he's not going to be a good blocker at the next level. But if you're able to pair home run hitter like Dylan Sampson with a guy who's a bit stronger, tougher, do it all in Cam Scatterbo, that's a really good pairing. I don't think teams are going to draft 2 running backs, or I'm not sure they'll have the opportunity to get both of these guys. But that's kind of the running back room that I think both of us are alluding to works in the NFL, right? If you don't have 2 like Ashton Genties or 2 do-it-alls, you need to have complementary pieces. Like the Panthers, Chuba Hubbard isn't the best pass catcher, but he runs tough up the middle, especially through the B gap. Rico Dowdle, a lot better on outside and pass catching. Very good tandem. If you can get 2 guys like that at the college level, I think you're really going to be pleased with yourself, especially in this draft, because we've only talked about 6 people, but there are a ton of like viable running backs in this class.
Absolutely. And you kind of brought up that kind of like duo. Carolina Panthers had that in double trouble with Jonathan Stewart and D'Angelo Williams. The Lions currently have that with their Sonic and Knuckles pairing with Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. And so having kind of that bruiser back and the more finesse back is how you should build a running back room, even if you have that do-it-all kind of guy, whether it's an Ashton Genty or some of these other star running backs like a Saquon Barkley. Like, it's interesting that they go from like a Kenneth Gainwell last year, who is more that finesse back, to now A.J. Dillon being the backup, who's more of a bruiser. So it's like, okay, are they asking Saquon Barkley to lean more on those outside runs and some of maybe the more up the middle type concepts that are going to hand more to A.J. Dillon for preservation? So it's just interesting to see how teams build the rooms, but that's always kind of like the thought processes of having that skill trait both present in either one back or multiple.
And I think with the Eagles is interesting because they got rid of Gainwell, who was their pass catching back, their 3rd down back. They already have a guy there in Will Shipley who really excels at that. When I was writing about him last year, I said he has like legitimate 95th percentile McCaffrey receiving traits. And you saw him show it as a returner. And I believe he scored, I don't know if it was in the Super Bowl or if it was in the NFC Championship, but he scored a touchdown there.
Well, he had the big run, but he got chased down, and then I think he scored a couple plays later. But it was one of those things, he ran out of juice. But yeah, Will Shipley has the ability to be that 3rd down back, like you're saying.
For sure. And then having Dillon there is just another piece of the pie, like a finesse bruiser back, where maybe if Jalen Hurts is tired and they can't push his rear end in, they can just say, hey, A.J. Dillon, here you go. And he's going to get you those 2 yards. Another one that I wanted to mention, I mean, there are so many running backs we can choose from, but Raheem Rocket Sanders from South Carolina, going back to his Arkansas days, I was a really big fan of him. He had a couple of foot injuries and started to slow down. Even his first year at South Carolina, he was quite like sluggish. But I thought this year he really played well. He's a guy that's kind of like Cam Scadaboo. Like he's really physical. Once he gets on the outside, I think he's a threat to score, but he's not going to break through the middle and go to the house. Very patient runner as well. That's a guy that I think the Panthers could kind of target in those later rounds. And another one that's been going around Twitter recently in Panthers Twitter is Damian Martinez from Miami, I believe. I'm just scrolling up to his notes, and he's kind of a pass blocker or pass catcher as well. He's patient and he's a willing blocker. So if you want like a Will Shipley kind of guy, I don't think he's on the same level receiving wise as Shipley was, but I believe Shipley was a 6th round pick, maybe 7th round pick. I think that's where you're going to find Damian Martinez in this class.
Interesting. I'm not a big Damian Martinez fan from what I've
I'm not
seen.
either, but I think he fits that that typecast, that archetype.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And for me, I think personally, I would rather have either a project running back that has like physical traits where it's like, okay, maybe you become a superstar. We can develop you like a Chuba Hubbard. There are things that we like that we feel like given a couple of years, we can develop into something special. Personally, I think for me, I like RJ Harvey in terms of having a third down back. It reminds me a lot of when we had Fozzie Whitaker, just that smaller guy that you get the ball in his hands and you don't know exactly what's going to happen because you have that kind of breakaway speed, very electric, one of the more explosive runners last year at the collegiate level. And then another guy, and I think this is just more the put out there. Again, the physical traits are very similar to Mario Hampton. And I think Mario Hampton and him, they're physical comps. If you're looking for an older running back to kind of go off of, it would be Deuce McAllister. The more recent modern version of the comparison for both Mario Hampton and DJ Giddens out of Kansas State would be Rashad White, so to speak. And he was a 1,000-yard rusher. Obviously, he wasn't the number one guy in Tampa Bay. Bucky Irving was that guy. But when you can kind of get maybe that kind of production out of a player or that kind of trajectory from someone on day 3, I think it's a great flyer to take. And that's more where I would lean rather than Damian Martinez, where I don't know if he has necessarily a lot of upside. I don't know if he's as physically gifted as some of these other running backs that we've been talking about. And it's just something to kind of keep an eye out. Like you said, fits a mold, fits a prototype. But when we're looking at maybe depth for the Carolina Panthers specifically, you already have your lead duo. In my opinion, it's either getting somebody that you can mold into a future superstar or that's going to play a complementary role and offers a skill set that's not necessarily on the team.
Yeah, I agree with you there. A couple of SEC guys that I think fall into those categories respectively. Jarquez Hunter, you have him here on your graphic here from Auburn. Really explosive runner. Both times, I don't think he was healthy his sophomore year, but his junior and senior year, when he played in the Iron Bowl against Alabama, he really performed, especially 2 years ago. He was like Auburn's entire offense in the game. That was the game where Milroe threw 4th and 31. Jarquez Hunter was the reason that Auburn had the lead in that game. He was quite special. And then Montrell Johnson. I think he's the guy from Florida. He transferred from Louisiana. He followed the Florida head coach there. And he's an explosive guy as well, where I think you could mold him into more of a well-rounded player. But he has the ability to hit home runs as it is right now. And we've talked about like 12 or 13 guys at this point, and that's only half of them. I think there's so many great running backs in this class where if you're a team like the Panthers, who probably this was before Rico Dowdle, we still had a need at running back, but I'm still taking a flyer on a guy in round 6, or I don't think we have a 6th-round pick, like in round 5, because we have a couple of those. Rico Dowdle is only going to be here for 1 year. Why not in 2026 have Chuba ready, Jonathan Brooks back and healthy, and have a young guy part of that rotation? I always, my policy, the running back brigade, I'm always going to draft one every year, at least in like the 5th round or something. And this year in particular is the year to do that.
It's just such a deep class that, like, why wouldn't you? Especially when you look at last year and Jonathan Brooks was probably as close to Yeah, you'd put him underneath a Mario Hampton from this year,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. He would be fighting in that group to be with Judkins and Caleb Johnson and Anderson. But
Yeah.
yeah, Genty and Hampton stand far above what we got last year.
And that's where it's just like when you have that top tier talent, and then when you look at like the depth of it, I obviously last year had some good depth, but I think this year has even more. So why not take a day 3? Because like you said,
Mm-hmm.
you got a running back that's on a 1-year deal. Chuba's not getting any younger, and you're not sure about Brooks' future with the back-to-back ACL tears. So taking another flyer, developing a guy while you have the position figured out is not the worst idea. And I think it's a really good one. And it's something that I think you've, like you said, been throwing out since we've been doing this podcast for the last 2 years.
Yeah, and I don't want to introduce you into your take, your perfect take of the week, but to that point, I think you have a take in line with that line of thinking.
Yeah, no, we'll do this perfect take and kick this section off. But I really do think the Panthers take a running back on day 3. We have a bunch of picks there. I think there's going to be a guy that they like in the interview process that's going to provide depth. And I think that's the big thing. I think the offensive line is mostly figured out. I think if we're going to take a wide receiver, we could take one day 3, but more than likely, I think it should be in the earlier rounds. Same with the defensive line. So it makes sense when you're kind of looking at the roster build and what you might be preparing for moving forward. So that's my take, and we'll find out come April if that's the case. I think day 3 typically is it's Saturday that it airs like middle of the day, so we'll find out. It'll bite me in the butt. They'll end up moving up at the end of like round 3 and taking a running back then, and then not taking one on day 3. But that's my luck. What is your take as we wrap up this episode?
Well, like if we want to look at it in terms of probability, like a probabilistic way of looking at it, day 3 has more than 50% of all the picks taken, if you take that into account. So if they're going to take one, it'll probably be on day 3 just by expectations, not factoring in roster needs or anything. But I wouldn't say we are a running back needy team at the moment. I like that one. I said we didn't have a 6th round pick, but you can always trade around. And if we end up with something in the latter half of day 3, I'm sure we'll take a flyer on somebody, maybe somebody we mentioned today. My take was going to be for this week an identical copy of my Tuesday take, which was we're going to see at least 2 QBs go. But I thought
was a little cheap. I did, so I'm glad you switched it up.
So I changed it, and I talked about how great of a prospect Ashton Genty really is, like how complete he is. I think if you matched him to high running backs in years past, he would be right up there, if not ahead of guys like Bijan Robinson, ahead of guys like Jahmyr Gibbs. And to that point, my take is that Ashton Genty, the 10th pick in the draft, is his ceiling or floor, by that matter. He's going to go in the top 10 picks, and I honestly don't think that that's going to be controversial. You look at the teams that need a running back in the draft, and you're going to have teams like Las Vegas. I could see them taking him at 6. I don't know what the Jets are going to do, but I could see the Jets having a flyer there. You never know. They have a new GM. The Saints, again, really confusing team to me. Alvin Kamara, they did just extend him, but you never know. And then I think Chicago really is his floor. We talked about at the top of the episode, Ben Johnson loves his Sonic and Knuckles pairings. A couple years ago, it was Jamal Williams, and I can't remember who the second
DeAndre
guy
Swift,
was.
the guy that he has right now.
Exactly, and he's seen firsthand what DeAndre Swift's limitations are. I really think that if they're not getting Ashton Genty, they're getting Amarian Hampton. But Ashton Genty will be taken in the top 10 picks. Lock it up.
I like it. I like that take. I would not be surprised to see the top 2 running backs taken within the top 20 picks. And maybe a third guy sneaks in at the end of the first round. But this is a really good running back draft class. It's a very weak draft class overall. So I think that's what's going to allow some of these players to kind of sneak into the first round. I think when we get close to the draft, we'll talk about kind of positional value and talk about how some of these non-premium positions don't usually offer as much surplus value. But when you've seen how well offenses have taken a step when adding a guy like Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs over the past couple of years, I think some of that mindset will start to shift as the gravitation of these players really starts to sink in with some of these more advanced metrics as they get better.
For sure. Stars at that level, they're not floor raisers, they're ceiling raisers. Look at what the Eagles did. Swift and Miles Sanders were 1,000-yard rushers, and they decided, let's upgrade it. Super Bowl. I'm not saying it's a one-to-one correlation, but people of that talent, like Ashton Gentias, can elevate the aspirations of a team. I think this was a good episode. We gave the running backs the love they deserve. Next week, we'll be back. Similar format as this week. We'll talk about wide receivers on Tuesday and and tight ends on Thursday. But until then, you can find us on Twitter, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your content. Stay tuned. We're going to do more draft stuff as it approaches, and keep pounding.